The sun hung high in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over the bustling streets of Dallas on that fateful afternoon. FBI Special Agent Anna Lawson maneuvered her sleek black sedan through the city's chaotic traffic, her mind still buzzing from the intensity of the investigation she'd just wrapped up. A brilliant and fiercely determined black woman, Anna had spent months chasing shadow-tracking a notorious drug cartel that had eluded authorities for far too long. She was on the cusp of a breakthrough, a victory that would solidify her reputation in an agency where she'd fought tooth and nail to belong. The exhaustion was palpable. Hours stretched into days, pressure mounting with every leadbit. Beneath it all simmered a quiet pride. Being one of the few black women in a sea of white, male faces at the FBI wasn't easy. Yet, through sheer grit and unshakable resolve, she'd carved out her place, earning respect one hard-won case at a time. Her fingers gripped the steering wheel as her thoughts raced, replaying the latest intelligence she'd uncovered: coded messages, intercepted shipments, a name whispered in the dark corners of the underworld. She was so absorbed in piecing it together that the sudden flash of blue lights in her rearview mirror jolted her like a thunderclap. Blinking in surprise, she flicked her gaze to the speedometer, steady, well within the limit. Confusion rippled through her. What could this possibly be about? With a steadying breath, she eased her car to the roadside, the tires crunching against gravel as she pulled over. Her heart thudded, not from fear, but from the sheer oddity of the moment. She was a federal agent, mid-case, mid-duty. This didn't add up. Behind her, a police cruiser rolled to a stop, its lights pulsing like a heartbeat in the afternoon haze. A tall figure emerged: Officer Harris, his name etched on the badge pinned to his crisp uniform. He strode toward her with deliberate steps, his broad frame casting a shadow over the car. His face was a mask of stern authority, lips pressed into a thin line, and his right hand rested lightly on the holster at his hip, a subtle but unmistakable signal. Anna's instincts sharpened. She lowered her window with a smooth, practiced motion, her demeanor calm but alert, and reached for her FBI badge, its weight of familiar comfort in her hand. "Good afternoon, officer," she said, her voice polite yet firm, laced with the quiet confidence of someone who knew her worth. "Is there a problem?" Harris barely flicked his eyes toward her outstretched badge. His response came sharp and cold, cutting through the air like a blade. "License and registration." No greeting, no acknowledgement, as to barked command. Anna's breath caught for a split second, startled by the hostility in his tone. She'd dealt with brusque cops before, jurisdictional egos clashing with federal authority. But this felt different. Still, she kept her composure, her years of training kicking in. "I'm an FBI agent," she said evenly, extending her badge further into his line of sight. "Here's my identification." He glanced at Ettore rather, through with his frown deepening, as if her words were an annoyance rather than a fact. "I said license and registration." The dismissal in his voice sent a shiver down her spine, a cold prickle of unease that settled deep in her gut. Something was wrong here, terribly wrong. She'd faced skepticism before, but this wasn't skepticism, it was disdain, raw and deliberate. Her pulse quickened, though her face remained a mask of professionalism. "Officer, I'm a federal agent on official duty," she repeated, her tone steady despite the storm brewing inside her. She wanted to de-escalate, to keep this from spiraling, but Harris wasn't listening. His eyes narrowed, glinting with something dark and unreadable. "Step out of the vehicle," he snapped, his voice rising like a whip crack. Anna froze, her mind racing to process the sudden escalation. "Excuse me," she said, her shock slipping through despite her best efforts. Harris leaned closer, his shadow looming over her open window. "Are you deaf? I said step out of the vehicle." His words carried an edge that drew the attention of passers. A woman pushing a stroller, a man with a briefcase slowed their steps, casting curious glances toward the scene unfolding on the roadside. Anna hesitated, her training warring with her instincts. She knew her rights, knew there was no lawful basis for the stop, let alone an order to exit her car. But the air was thick with tension, charged with an undercurrent she couldn't ignore. Personal, power-driven. She took a measured breath, her voice firm but controlled. "Officer, I'm complying with your request, but I need you to understand I'm an FBI agent." She emphasized each word, hoping to pierce through his wall of hostility. Harris's face twisted, his lip curling in a sneer. "I don't care if you're the president. Step out, or I'll drag you out myself." The threat hit her like a punch to the chest. Her stomach knotted, a mix of disbelief and fury coiling tight inside her. Slowly, deliberately, she unlatched her door and stepped onto the pavement, her hands raised and visible, every movement calculated to avoid giving him an excuse. The crowd grew, people whispering, some pulling out phones to record, their murmurs a low hum against the distant roar of traffic. But no one stepped forward. No one challenged the officer towering over her. Harris moved fast, his grip closing around her arm with bruising force. Before she could react, he shoved her against the car, the metal cool and unyielding against her back. "Hey, what are you doing?" she protested, her voice sharp with outrage. Though it trembled at the edges, she wasn't afraid, not yet, but the violation of it. The sheer audacity burned through her. "Resisting arrest, huh?" Harris sneered, twisting her arm behind her back with a roughness that made her wince. "You think you can flash a badge and do whatever you want, don't you?" The handcuffs clicked shut, biting into her wrists, and Anna's breath hitched. This wasn't just humiliating, it was a deliberate stripping of her dignity, her authority, her very identity. The onlookers gaped, some wide-eyed with shock, others shaking their heads in quiet disbelief. A young woman with braided hair clutched her phone tighter, her brow furrowed as she filmed, while an older man in a faded baseball cap muttered something to his companion, his expression a mix of sympathy and helplessness. Anna's cheeks flushed hot with a cocktail of anger and shame, but she straightened her spine, refusing to let this break her. She'd faced worse interrogations, threats, the weight of proving herself in a world that often doubted her. This was an injustice she wouldn't bow to. "Officer Harris, you're making a mistake," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor of rage beneath it. He scoffed, yanking her toward his patrol car. "Shut your mouth. You think you're better than everyone else just because you're FBI. You're not above the law." The irony of his words stung. Here he was, abusing his power, twisting the law into a weapon against her, while accusing her of arrogance. Anna's mind spun, a whirlwind of options and outcomes. She had to stay calm, had to think. Her colleagues would be stunned, arrested on duty. For nothing, she could call for backup, file a complaint, fight this through proper channels. But in this moment, she was powerless, dragged to the cruiser like a suspect. He shoved her into the back seat, the door slamming shut with a finality that echoed in her bones. She caught one last glimpse of the crowd, the young woman still recording, the older man looking away, ashamed, and then the car lurched forward. The cuffs dug deeper into her skin, the ache radiating up her arms as the city blurred past the window. Anna's thoughts raced faster than the streets outside. Harris wasn't just a cop doing his job, was a man with a vendetta, whether against her race, her authority, or both. His smirk in the rearview mirror confirmed it. "You really thought you could get away with pretending to be FBI, didn't you?" he taunted, his voice dripping with mockery. "I'm not pretending," she shot back, her tone icy and resolute. "I am a federal agent, and you're the one making a mistake." He let fade a harsh, grating sound. "Sure you are. And I'm the chief of police." The sarcasm was a slap, but Anna refused to rise to it. Her blood boiled, her pride screaming for release, but she clamped it down. There was no winning an argument with him, not here, not now. The car rolled to a stop outside a squat, weathered police station on the edge of town, its faded brick walls and flickering sign a far cry from the precinct she knew. Her stomach sank. This wasn't routine, this was personal. As Harris stepped out, barking orders to a weary desk clerk who barely looked up from his paperwork, Anna sat in the silence of the back seat, her wrists throbbing, her resolve hardening. She'd built her career on justice and holding the powerful accountable, on protecting the vulnerable. Now, she was the one caught in the crosshairs of unchecked authority. But this wasn't the end. It was a beginning. Harris had crossed a line, and she wouldn't let it stand. Justice wasn't just her job, it was her lifeline. And as the consequences of his actions loomed legal, moral, inevitably, she vowed to turn this moment of humiliation into a reckoning. The law wasn't his to wield like a club. It was hers to uphold. And she would. The remote, dilapidated station stood like a forgotten relic on the edge of town. Its cracked walls and peeling paint a testament to years of neglect. It was no accident that Harris had chosen this place, Anna thought, her heart pounding harder with every passing second. This wasn't some random stop on her journey, it was a calculated move, a deliberate effort to keep her far from prying eyes, away from the higher-ups or the watchful gaze of the FBI. The air felt thick with tension as the realization sank in, tightening her chest. Harris wasn't just trying to detain her, he was orchestrating her isolation, ensuring no one could step in to challenge his authority. The gravity of her predicament hit her like a cold wave, and beneath her calm exterior, a flicker of dread began to grow. Harris flung open the car door with a grunt, his meaty hand clamping around her arm like a vice. He yanked her out of the vehicle with a force that made her stumble, her boots scraping against the gravel. "Let go, Agent Lawson," he snarled, his voice dripping with mockery as he spat out her title like it was a punchline to some cruel joke. The insult stung, a sharp jab at her pride, but Anna clenched her jaw and refused to let it show. She'd faced worse in her years on the job, hostile interrogations, life-or-death standoffs, but this was different. Harris wasn't just a bully with a badge, he was a predator, and she could feel his intent to dismantle her, resolve radiating off him in waves. Her stomach twisted, but she straightened her spine, her green eyes locking onto his with defiance. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her crack. Inside, the station was a hollow shell, its silence almost oppressive. The faint hum of a flickering fluorescent bulb overhead was the only sound breaking the stillness. A handful of officers slumped at their desks, their heads barely lifting as Harris dragged her through the room. Their indifference was chilling, eyes glazed over, faces blank, as if this kind of scene played out so often it had become routine. Anna's pulse quickened as she scanned their expressions, searching for a flicker of concern, a hint of humanity. There was none. It dawned on her then, with a shiver that ran down her spine, that no one here would lift a finger to help her. This was Harris's domain, a place where his word was law, and she was utterly alone. He shoved her into a cramped interrogation room with a roughness that made her shoulder ache, the heavy door slamming shut behind them with a metallic clang that echoed in her ears. The space was suffocating, dimly lit by a single, grimy bulb dangling from the ceiling, casting long shadows across the chipped metal table and to rickety chairs. Anna's breath hitched as she took it all in, her mind racing. This wasn't just a room. It was a trap, a corner of the world where her authority as an agent meant nothing. Harris paced in front of her like a caged animal, his boots thudding against the concrete floor, his voice a low, menacing growl. "Let's get one thing straight," he said, stopping abruptly to loom over her, his hulking frame blocking out the light. "I don't care who you say you are. To me, you're just another lowlife trying to scam your way out of trouble." Anna's hands balled into fists behind her back, the cold bite of the handcuffs digging into her wrists. She met his gaze unflinchingly, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "You're violating my rights, Harris. You've got no grounds to hold me here, and when this is over, you'll wish you'd never started this." Her words were sharp, laced with a quiet fury that she hoped would pierce his arrogance. For a moment, he froze, his face inches from hers, his breath hot and sour against her skin. "Is that a threat, Agent Lawson?" he sneered, his tone mocking, daring her to push him further. She didn't flinch, her resolve hardening like steel. "It's a promise," she replied, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Harris stared at her, his dark eyes narrowing into slits, his jaw tightening. Then, with a smirk that twisted his lips into something sinister, he straightened up. "We'll see about that," he muttered, his tone dripping with contempt as he turned and stormed out, the door clicking shut behind him with a finality that made her stomach drop. Alone in the suffocating silence, Anna let out a slow, shaky breath, her mind whirling. She had to get word to her team, Simeon, anyone outside this forsaken place. Relying on anyone here was out of the question. Harris would make sure of that. Her eyes darted around the room, desperate for a lifeline. A tiny window sat high on the wall, its grimy glass taunting her from a height she couldn't hope to reach. The door was locked tight, and with her hands still cuffed, The badge tucked in her jacket pocket, their last shred of authority was useless. Frustration clawed at her chest, a feeling she wasn't accustomed to. She'd always been the one in control, the one calling the shots. Now, the tables had turned, and the powerlessness gnawed at her. Time stretched on, each minute an eternity as she sat there, her mind racing for a plan. Then, the door creaked open, and a new figure stepped in, a younger officer, maybe in his early 30s, with a mop of sandy hair and a nervous energy that set him apart from Harris's brute confidence. His uniform was slightly wrinkled, his badge gleaming faintly under the dim light. "Agent Lawson," he began, his voice tentative as he clutched a thin file in his hands. "I'm Officer Cole. I've been told to process you for holding, but I just wanted to say I'm sorry about all this." His eyes flicked to hers, then away, a flush creeping up his neck. Anna studied him, her instincts kicking into overdrive. There was something in his demon Orgwilt, maybe, or doubt, that made him different. Beneath his unease, she sensed a flicker of decency, a crack in the wall of complicity that surrounded this place. "It's okay, Officer Cole," she said, forcing her voice to stay even, though her heart was hammering. "I understand the situation, but you need to know this is wrong. You've got a choice here." She watched him closely, searching for a sign that he might break from Harris's influence. Cole shifted on his feet, his fingers tightening around the file, his brow furrowing as if her words had struck a nerve. Before he could respond, the door burst open with a bang, and Harris stormed back in, his face a mask of fury. "What the hell are you waiting for?" he barked, his voice booming in the small space as he glared at Cole. "Get her processed. She's just another perp, not some riddle to figure out." Cole flinched, his shoulders hunching under the weight of Harris's rage. But Anna could see the conflict flickering in his eyes. He nodded reluctantly, pulling out a notepad with trembling hands. "I'll need some basic information, Agent Lawson," he mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. "Name, date of birth, the usual." His pen scratched across the paper, but his movements were jerky, his gaze darting nervously between her and the door. Anna leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a firm, urgent whisper. "You know what's happening here isn't right, Cole. You might not make the rules, but you can choose whether to follow orders you know are unjust." For a heartbeat, Cole froze, his pen hovering midair, his breath catching. She could see the war raging inside him, loyalty to Harris clashing with a buried sense of right and wrong. His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard, his eyes locking onto hers with a mix of fear and uncertainty. Before he could answer, Harris barged back in, his presence filling the room like a storm cloud. "What's taking so damn long?" he roared, his face flushed red. "She's a criminal, not a guest. Get her processed and get her out of my sight." Cole jumped to his feet, stammering. "I was just getting her information," but Harris cut him off with a sneer. "I don't care about her name or her sob story. Get it done." Cole's hands shook as he gathered the papers, his face a mask of apology as he motioned for Anna to follow him. She rose slowly, her mind already spinning with possibilities. Harris might think he'd won, but he had no idea who he was up against. She'd spent her career fighting for justice, clawing her way through corruption and chaos, and she wasn't about to let this petty tyrant unravel everything she stood for. They moved through the station's narrow, dimly lit hallways, the walls stained with years of neglect, the air heavy with the scent of mildew and stale coffee. Cole led the way, his head bowed, avoiding her gaze while Anna's senses stayed razor-sharp, tracking every detail. At the end of the corridor, they reached a small holding cell, a stark, unforgiving box with cold steel bars and a single bench bolted to the wall. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed and flickered, casting harsh shadows across the concrete floor. Cole unlocked the door with a shaky hand, and Anna stepped inside, her stomach sinking as the reality hit her. This wasn't just a detainment, it was a calculated effort to erase her, to bury her where no one would look. As the door clanged shut, she turned to Cole, who lingered by the bars, his eyes darting away from hers. "You don't have to do this," she said softly. One last plea to his conscience. He hesitated, his fingers tightening around the keys, but then he turned and walked away, leaving her in the flickering gloom. Alone again, Anna surveyed the barren cell, her mind racing. Harris thought he could break her, that he could wield his power unchecked. But justice wasn't just a badge she carried, it was a fire in her veins. And if there was one lesson she'd learned, it was that abusing power came with consequences. She'd find a way out, and when she did, Harris would face the reckoning he'd so arrogantly dismissed. The air in the cramped cell hung heavy with tension as Officer Cole shuffled uneasily, his boots scuffing the worn linoleum floor. His eyes darted between Anna, seated rigidly on the cold metal bench, and the shadowed hallway stretching beyond the bars. Sweat beaded faintly along his brow, betraying the storm of discomfort brewing inside him. He wasn't a cruel man by nature, Anna could sense that much, but he also wasn't brave enough to act against the currents pulling him along. "We'll be back soon," he mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper, as if he feared the walls themselves might carry his words to the wrong ears. His gaze dropped to his feet, lingering there for a moment as though the floor held some secret answer, before he turned sharply and disappeared down the corridor. The sound of his retreating footsteps faded into an oppressive silence, leaving Anna alone with her racing thoughts. Time crawled forward, each minute stretching into an eternity of icy dread. The bench beneath her seemed to leach warmth from her body, its chill seeping through her clothes and into her bones. She clasped her hands tightly in her lap, her knuckles whitening as she fought to anchor herself amid the chaos swirling in her mind. She had to stay calm. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. As an FBI agent, she knew her rights like a second language, reciting them silently to herself as a shield against the rising tide of fear. Harris, the man orchestrating this nightmare, was playing a game with stakes higher than he realized, a reckless dance with power that could topple him if she played her cards right. Anna's jaw tightened with resolve. She wasn't just some helpless detainee. She held a secret Harris couldn't even fathom, a hidden strength that fueled her determination. She wouldn't let him shatter her spirit. Her mind churned furiously, piecing together a plan to flip the script, to wrest control from his greedy hands. Every tick of the unseen clock intensified the pressure, a relentless reminder that Harris might soon discover her location and her advantage. A sudden clatter of footsteps reverberated through the hallway, snapping Anna from her spiraling thoughts. Her body stiffened instinctively, every muscle coiling as she braced herself for the unknown. Her pulse hammered in her chest, a frantic drumbeat echoing in her ears as the sound grew louder. Closer. Then, Cole emerged from the gloom, but this time he wasn't alone. Trailing behind him loomed a taller figure, an older officer with a weathered face etched with lines of uncertainty. His nameplate glinted faintly in the dim light, Jackson. Unlike Cole's nervous fidgeting, Jackson carried himself with a quiet hesitance, his dark eyes flickering over Anna with a mix of curiosity and unease. He cast a quick, wary glance toward the door, as if expecting Harris to materialize from the shadows at any moment. "I'm Officer Jackson," he said, his voice low and tentative, threading through the silence like a fragile lifeline. "I'm here to process you, Agent Lawson." There was something in his tone, soft, almost apologetic, set him apart from the others. Anna met his gaze, searching those shadowed eyes for a crack in the facade. He didn't radiate the same cold hostility she'd come to expect from Harris's lackeys. Instead, he seemed adrift, caught in a tide he wasn't sure he wanted to ride. This flicker of doubt in him sparked an ember of hope in her chest. Maybe, just maybe, Jackson could be her way out. "What's going on here?" Anna asked, her voice steady, but laced with an edge of desperation she couldn't fully mask. She leaned forward slightly, her hands gripping the edge of the bench. "I don't belong here. You have to help me." Her words hung in the air, a plea wrapped in steel, daring him to look away from the truth. Jackson's eyes darted nervously toward the hallway again, his broad shoulders hunching as though he could shrink from the weight of her demand. He stepped closer to the bars, his fingers twitching near his belt as he lowered his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Listen, Agent Lawson, I know this doesn't feel right. I can see that much. But I can't just waltz out of here and make it all vanish." His admission trembled with fear, his gaze flickering with the turmoil of a man wrestling with his own moral compass. Anna could almost feel the burden pressing down on him, the invisible chains of loyalty to a system he didn't fully trust. Yet beneath his apprehension, she glimpsed a spark of decency, a reluctance to blindly follow Harris's corrupt lead. "You don't have to do this, Officer Jackson," she said softly, her tone unwavering despite the fury simmering just beneath her calm surface. "You've got a choice right here, right now. I'm an FBI agent. This is a mistake, and deep down, you know it." She held his gaze, willing him to see the justice in her words, the righteousness of stepping beyond the shadows of fear. For a long, agonizing moment, Jackson said nothing. His eyes fell to the floor, his breath shallow as he grappled with the decision before him. Anna watched the war play out across his face, the furrow of his brow, the tightening of his jaw. He was a man teetering on the edge, torn between the safety of compliance and the perilous call of conscience in a place where corruption festered like an open wound. When he finally looked up, his dark eyes shimmered with uncertainty. "I can't just let you go. Agent Lawson," he murmured, the words heavy with regret. "Harris has everyone under his thumb. But I'll do what I can to get you out of here soon. Just hold on." Anna nodded, a quiet gratitude blooming within her despite the delay. It wasn't freedom, not yet, but it was a life-alinea promise from someone who hadn't fully surrendered to the darkness. Jackson stepped back, his hand hovering over the keys at his hip, fingers trembling as if itching to turn the lock. But before he could act, the door to the interrogation room burst open with a jarring clang, and Officer Harris stormed in like a tempest unleashed. His presence filled the space with a suffocating menace, his face a twisted mask of fury and smug satisfaction. Jackson recoiled from the bars, his posture snapping rigid as if he'd been caught in some forbidden act. Harris's eyes narrowed to slits, darting between Jackson and Anna with predatory intensity. "What's going on in here?" he barked, his voice a sharp blade slicing through the tension. "Have you processed her yet? She's just another criminal. What the hell are you waiting for?" Jackson stammered, his words tripping over themselves in a frantic bid to explain. Tu was just about to, but Harris cut him off with a dismissive wave, his patience as thin as a razor's edge. "Well, hurry it up. She doesn't belong here wasting my time." He wheeled toward Anna, his gaze hardening into something cold and unyielding. "You think you can outsmart me with that shiny badge of yours? You've got a harsh lesson coming your way." Anna's pulse surged, a wildfire of adrenaline coursing through her veins. She'd known this confrontation was inevitable from the moment Harris had first locked eyes with her, his intent as clear as the malice in his sneer. He was a man drunk on power, determined to crush her beneath his heel, but she refused to bend. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice calm yet resonant with the quiet authority she'd honed over years of facing down threats. "I won't let you intimidate me. This won't end well for you, Officer Harris. You'll answer for what you've done." Harris scoffed, his lips curling into a sneer of contempt. "You don't scare me, Agent Lawson. You think you can strut in here and dictate terms? I'll make sure you regret every move you've made against me." The air between them crackled with unspoken threats, the room shrinking under the weight of their standoff. Anna's heartbeat thundered in her ears, a relentless rhythm fueled by rage and the dawning certainty that this clash was about to escalate beyond her control. The door slammed open again, the sound ricocheting off the walls like a gunshot. A group of officers streamed in, led by the imposing figure of Lieutenant Daniels. Anna's stomach twisted into a knot of dread as recognition sank into Daniels. With his cool, calculating demeanor, was no stranger to Harris's schemes. His presence confirmed her worst fears. The corruption ran deeper than she'd imagined, a tangled web with Daniels pulling strings alongside Harris. "What's the situation here?" he asked, his voice smooth and detached, his eyes sweeping the room with a disdain that made Anna's skin crawl. When his gaze settled on her, it carried the weight of silent judgment, a tidal wave threatening to drown her resolve. "She's a problem," Harris spat, venom dripping from every syllable. "A federal agent who thinks she can run wild. It's time we put her in her place." Daniels tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable, though Anna could sense the gears grinding in his mind. He didn't reply immediately, his silence a calculated pause as he weighed his options. Then, with a faint nod, he spoke. "We need to contain her. She's too much of a liability to leave unchecked." Anna's eyes flicked between the two men, a sickening realization settling in her gut. They were a united front, a machine built to dismantle her piece by piece, to bury their secrets beneath her ruin. but she wasn't finishing it by a long shot. Her gaze shifted to Cole, lingering in the background, his face pale and drawn. He hadn't spoken, hadn't moved, but she could see the conflict etched into his features, the flicker of doubt that hadn't yet been snuffed out. "Cole," she said, her voice cutting through the din with unwavering clarity. "You still have time to do what's right. You can't let them get away with this. You have a choice." Cole's eyes darted between her and the officers surrounding him, his breath hitching as indecision gripped him, his hands clenched at his sides, knuckles white against the muted green of his uniform. For a fleeting moment, it seemed he might step forward, might break free from the shadows holding him back. But before he could act, Harris lunged toward Anna, his face contorted with rage. "Enough of this," he roared, seizing her arm in a bruising grip and yanking her toward the door. Anna resisted, her muscles straining as she dug her heels into the floor, refusing to be dragged away like a helpless prisoner. Her anger flared hotter, a blazing fire she could no longer contain. Though she fought to keep her mind clear, she couldn't let them break her now, not ever. She had to escape this trap, had to strike back against the injustice closing in around her. As the door slammed shut behind them with a resounding crash, the stakes crystallized in her mind. Harris was tightening his noose, but Anna wasn't about to surrender. She'd fight with everything she had, a lone ember against a storm. Because the lesson here was clear. Justice wasn't handed out, it was seized. And the consequences of unchecked power would one day come crashing down on those who wielded it so carelessly. The frigid metal of the handcuffs gnawed at Anna Lawson's wrists, each jagged edge pressing deeper into her skin as she sat confined in the back seat of yet another patrol car. The night outside was a thick, impenetrable shroud, pierced only by the harsh glare of the headlights slicing through the Dallas streets. Anna's sharp eyes darted around, scanning every shadow, every flicker of movement beyond the tinted windows. Her mind churned with a relentless urgency. She wasn't just a passenger in this vehicle. She was a chess player calculating her next move in a game, where the stakes were nothing less than her survival. Harris, that looming specter of corruption, was tracking her every breath. She could feel his presence, like a storm cloud swelling on the horizon, heavy with unspoken threats. Yet, amidst the rising tension that crackled in the air like static before a lightning strike, a spark of hope flickered within her. Somewhere out there, an ally waited, her lifeline, her shot at justice. The car barreled through the darkened city, tires humming against the asphalt as the urban sprawl of Dallas blurred past. Anna's thoughts raced faster than the vehicle itself, a whirlwind of strategy and resolve. She couldn't let panic take root, though her pulse thudded in her ears with every passing second. Harris wasn't the type to let this end quietly escalate, push the boundaries of his power until they snapped. She had to outmaneuver him, turn this spiraling nightmare into an opportunity. One misstep, one fleeting lapse in judgment, and he'd have her pinned, his leverage tightening like a noose around her neck. She couldn't afford that, not now, not when she'd clawed her way this far. Memories flooded her mind as the patrol car plunged deeper into the city's underbelly. Years of training surged to the forefront, grueling drills, sleepless nights, countless moments when the odds had towered over her like mountains. Yet she'd always found a way to scale them. Each victory had forged her into something unyielding, a woman who thrived in the crucible of chaos. This wouldn't be the moment that shattered her. She refused to let it be. The car lurched to a sudden, screeching stop, jolting her forward. Peering through the grimy window, she took in the sight of an abandoned building squatting in the gloom, an old relic of Dallas's forgotten corners, its silhouette jagged against the moonless sky. The silence that enveloped the place was eerie, almost alive, pressing against her chest like a physical weight. Her nerves prickled, every instinct screaming that this was no random detour. Harris emerged from the driver's seat, his movements deliberate, predatory. Without a word, he wrenched the door open and seized her arm, his grip bruising as he hauled her from the car. The night air hit her like a slap, cold and biting, seeping through her jacket as he shoved her toward the building's gaping entrance. She stumbled but caught herself, her spine stiffening with defiance. She wouldn't let him see her falter. Inside, the stillness was suffocating, a heavy blanket of quiet that swallowed every sound. The walls were crumbling, streaked with decay, and rusted metal doors hung crookedly on their hinges. This wasn't some haphazard idiot, it was a calculated choice. A tomb designed to erase her from existence without a whisper reaching the outside world. Harris's hand clamped around her arm again, dragging her toward a small room at the back. Her heart hammered against her ribcage, but she wrestled her fear into submission. Forcing her face into a mask of calm, she couldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her tremble. The door slammed shut behind them, with a clang that reverberated through the cramped, spacious, sparse chamber furnished only with a rickety table and a pair of chairs. A single bulb dangled overhead, its weak light stuttering, casting long, distorted shadows that danced across the peeling walls. Anna's breath caught as she assessed her surroundings. The odds were stacked against her here, a towering pile of disadvantage she'd have to topple. "You're in my territory now, Agent Lawson," Harris spat, his voice dripping with venom. His eyes blazed with a fury that seemed to consume the room, a wildfire of rage and arrogance. "I'm not about to let some meddling FBI agent waltz in and dismantle everything I've built." His words were a blade, sharp and personal, aimed straight at her resolve. Anna's throat tightened, a lump of dread lodging there, but she swallowed it down. "You're digging your own grave, Harris," she replied, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "You can't just erase people because they threaten your little empire. The truth doesn't bend to your will." He sneered, stepping closer, his bulk casting a shadow that swallowed her own. "You think I'm afraid of you? You're nothing, just another pawn who got too full of herself." His breath was hot and sour, his proximity suffocating. Anna's mind spun, searching for an escape, a life, anything to wrest control from his grasp. But Harris wasn't giving her a moment's reprieve. He loomed over her, his presence a physical weight, his voice sinking to a growl. "By the time I'm done, your career will be ashes. No one will believe a word you say." Just as his threat coiled tighter around her, a faint sound pierced the silence. Footsteps. Hesitant but growing nearer, Anna's heart skipped, a fragile thread of hope threading through her despair. Could it be? The door creaked open, and a figure materialized in the threshold. Officer Cole, his young face pale, his voice quivering as he spoke. "Harris, you can't do this. This isn't right." His words trembled, but there was a flicker of conviction beneath his fear. Anna's gaze locked onto him, her pulse racing with a desperate optimism. Was he her salvation, or just another cog in Harris's machine? Harris whirled on Cole, his expression hardening into something feral. "You've got 5 seconds to get out of here, Cole, or you'll regret it." His tone was a warning shot, laced with menace. Cole froze, his hands twitching at his sides, his eyes darting between Harris and Anna. She saw Athena crack in his loyalty, a glimmer of doubt widening into a chasm. This was her opening. "Cole, you have to help me," she urged, her voice cutting through the tension like a lifeline. "You know this is wrong. You can't let him bury the truth." For an agonizing eternity, Cole stood there, torn between the safety of obedience and the jagged edge of morality. His face was a battlefield, fear warring with something deeper, perhaps a shred of decency he hadn't yet lost. Finally, he nodded, a jerky motion that betrayed his terror. "I'll help you," he whispered, the words barely audible, "but we've got to move now." Relief surged through Anna, a fleeting warmth amidst the cold dread. Time was a luxury they didn't have. Cole gestured frantically, and she followed him into the narrow hallway. Their footsteps muffled against the warped floorboards. Every creak felt like a gunshot, every shadow a potential betrayal. Her heart pounded a frantic rhythm, adrenaline flooding her veins as she fought to keep her composure. The building's corridors twisted like a labyrinth, dark and claustrophobic, but they pressed forward, their movements swift and silent. Freedom was so close she could taste it, sharp and metallic on her tongue. They reached a back door, its paint peeling in long, curling strips. Cole fumbled with a ring of keys, his hands shaking as he jammed one into the lock. The click of the mechanism was deafening, a beacon in the stillness. But before they could step into the night, a voice slithered from the shadows behind them. "Going somewhere." Anna's blood turned to ice. Harris stood there, his silhouette framed by the dim light, a smug grin twisting his features. He'd anticipated their move, and now he had them trapped. "I knew you'd try something," he said, his tone thick with triumph. "You think you can just slip away? Not on my watch. He advanced, blocking their only exit, his presence a wall of malice. Anna's pulse thundered, her mind racing for a counterattack. Cole's breath hitched beside her, his fear palpable as the reality of their predicament sank in. "You think you're clever," Harris taunted, his voice a low, mocking drawl. "But you're nothing. Lawson, you're stuck, and when I'm through, your story dies with you." She squared her shoulders, defiance blazing in her chest. He wanted her to cower, but she wouldn't give him the satisfaction. "You're the one who's miscalculated, Harris," she shot back, her voice fierce and unwavering. "You don't know what I'm capable of. I'm not finished yet." His laugh was a guttural bark, dripping with scorn as he stepped closer, his intent clear, meant to crush her here and now. But before he could close the distance, a deafening bang erupted from the hallway, followed by the unmistakable thud of boots storming the floor. Anna's breath caught, her hope reigniting like a flare in the dark. Cole's eyes widened, his whisper frantic. "What's happening?" Before Harris could react, the door burst open, and Lieutenant Daniels stormed in, flanked by 2 officers, their faces grim with purpose. Harris's smug mask shattered, his rage twisting into something impotent as his power crumbled before their eyes. In that moment, Anna saw the inevitable fall of a man who'd wielded authority like a weapon, blind to the consequences. Justice wasn't just a word. It was a force, patient and unrelenting, and it had found him at last. For all his bluster, Harris had underestimated her, underestimated the truth. And that, she knew, would be his undoing. The air in the dimly lit room felt thick and suffocating, charged with an unspoken heaviness that pressed down on everyone inside. Just moments ago, Daniels had been pacing near the doorway, his broad shoulders hunched as if carrying an invisible burden. Now, he stood still, his sharp eyes locked on Harris with an intensity that could cut through steel. Anna, her wrists still aching from the tight grip of the restraints that had bound her earlier, stood a few feet away, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the tension radiating off Daniels, a storm brewing beneath his composed exterior, and it sent a shiver down her spine. The flickering fluorescent light overhead buzzed faintly, casting harsh shadows across the cracked concrete floor, amplifying the unease that hung between them. "What the hell do you think you're doing, Harris?" Daniel's voice sliced through the silence, low and icy, each word dripping with authority that demanded obedience. His tone wasn't just a reprimand, it was a warning, a signal that the line had been crossed and there was no turning back. "You're throwing everything we've built into the fire, everything we've sacrificed for." His jaw clenched as he spoke, the muscles in his face tightening with barely restrained fury. He took a deliberate step forward, his boots echoing against the floor, his presence filling the cramped space like a force of nature. Harris, standing near the far wall with his arms crossed, stiffened at the accusation, his chest puffed out slightly, a reflexive attempt to reclaim the dominance he was so desperate to hold onto. His dark eyes narrowed, glinting with defiance as he squared his shoulders. "She's a threat." "Daniels," he shot back, his voice rough and edged with frustration. "She's FBI. You think I'm just gonna sit here and let her unravel everything? I'm doing what has to be done." His hands trembled faintly, not from fear, Anna noticed, but from the raw, unchecked anger coursing through him. He gestured toward her with a sharp jerk of his chin, his lips curling into a sneer as if her very existence offended him. Daniel's gaze darkened, his eyes narrowing into slits as he took another step closer, closing the distance between them. The air seemed to crackle with the weight of his resolve. "You're out of line, Harris," he said, his voice steady, but laced with a cold fury that made Anna's breath catch. "I don't give a damn who she is. You've gone too far. Let her go." Now, his words weren't a request, they were a command, delivered with the unshakable certainty of a man who knew the cost of power and the ruin that came with abusing it. For Anna, those words sparked a fragile flicker of hope deep within her chest, a tiny ember glowing amidst the chaos that had consumed her night. She straightened slightly, her shoulders lifting as she fought to steady her breathing. Her mind raced, torn between relief and caution. Daniel's intervention was a lifeline, but she wasn't naive enough to let her guard down completely. The danger still loomed, a shadow lurking just beyond the edges of this fleeting reprieve. She pressed her lips into a thin line, her fingers curling into fists at her sides as she willed herself to stay sharp, to keep pushing forward. Harris' face twisted with rage, his features contorting as he jabbed a finger in Daniel's direction. "You don't get to storm in here and tell me how to run things," he snarled, his voice rising with each word, cracking under the strain of his fury. "This is my operation. I call the shots, not you." His hands shook more visibly now, the tremor betraying the cracks in his bravado. He took a step toward Daniels, his chest heaving, as if he might lunge at him, though something in Daniels' unflinching stare seemed to hold him back. Daniels didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He moved forward again, his face a mask of unyielding determination, his presence towering over Harris despite their similar heights. "Not anymore," he said, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "You've crossed a line you can't come back from. Step aside, Harris. This ends now." His tone was final, a judge delivering a verdict, and it carried the weight of a man who understood justice not as a vague ideal, but as a hard-earned necessity forged through years of witnessing its absence. The room fell into a suffocating stillness, time itself seeming to pause as Harris' gaze darted between Daniels and Anna. His face was a storm of conflicting emotions, fury, disbelief, and a grudging recognition that he was outmatched. His lips parted as if to argue, but no words came. Instead, a low growl rumbled from his throat, a sound of pure frustration. Before he stepped aside with a jerking motion, his reluctance palpable. Anna felt the shift immediately, the invisible chains that had held her loosening as she rose to her full height. Her legs trembled beneath her, but she forced them steady, her chin lifting with a defiance she hadn't known she still possessed. "You've lost, Harris," she said, her voice ringing out sharp and clear, cutting through the haze of tension like a beacon. "It's over." There was power in those words, a strength she drew from the depths of her exhaustion and fear, a resolve that had been tempered by every moment of doubt she'd endured. She met his gaze unflinchingly, watching as the fire in his eyes dimmed, replaced by a flicker of defeat he couldn't hide. Daniels gave a curt nod to the officers who had trailed him into the room, their boots scuffing softly against the floor as they stepped forward. They were younger men, their faces etched with a mix of uncertainty and respect for Daniels' authority. "Take her into protective custody," he instructed, his voice calm but firm. "We'll sort out who's behind this mess." The officers moved quickly, their movements precise as they flanked Anna, guiding her toward the door. She felt a wave of relief crash over her, cool and soothing against the heat of her adrenaline-soaked nerves. It wasn't freedom yet, but it was a chance, a crack in the darkness through which she could glimpse a way forward. As they led her through the labyrinthine corridors of the precinct, the walls seemed to close in around her, their faded paint and chipped edges a testament to years of neglect. The air smelled faintly of stale coffee and cigarette smoke, a reminder of the countless nights spent within these confines. Anna's steps echoed faintly, each one a small victory as she moved further from Harris' grasp. The officers escorting her exchanged quiet glances, their deference to Daniels evident in the way they carried themselves, shoulders squared, heads held high. It bolstered her confidence, a fragile thread of trust weaving through the fear that still gnawed at her insides. Beside her, Coley, a weary, nervous man who'd been dragged into this chaos almost as unwillingly as she had shuffled along, his hands buried deep in his pockets. His sandy hair fell into his eyes as he muttered under his breath, "Never thought I'd see the day Harris went down." His voice was shaky, tinged with disbelief, but there was something else there too, a quiet admiration, a spark of pride that he'd played a part in it. He glanced at Anna, his hazel eyes flickering with unease, yet softened by a hint of respect. "You did the right thing, Cole," Anna said softly, her words steady despite the exhaustion tugging at her limbs. "You helped me. Now we can make sure Harris doesn't get the chance to hurt anyone else." She offered him a small, reassuring nod, and his shoulders relaxed slightly, as if her acknowledgement had lifted a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying. They reached a small back office, its door creaking as Daniels pushed it open. The room was sparse, furnished only with a battered desk, a flickering lamp, and a single chair that wobbled on uneven legs. The walls were lined with filing cabinets, their metal surfaces dented and rusted, a silent archive of the precinct's secrets. Daniels turned to Anna, his expression softening for the first time that night. "We've got your back now, Lawson," he said, his voice quieter but no less resolute. "But we need to move fast. This is bigger than we thought, bigger than Harris alone." His words hung in the air, heavy with the promise of answers and the threat of what still lay ahead. Anna nodded, her mind spinning as she tried to quiet the storm of thoughts raging within her. Harris had been a predator, his influence a dark web that had ensnared the precinct in its threads. The realization of how much power he'd wielded and how close he'd come to destroying her sent a chill through her bones. But this wasn't the end. There were still questions, layers of corruption she hadn't yet peeled back, and she was determined to uncover every last one. "I won't stop until Harris and everyone tied to this is held accountable," she said, her voice unwavering, fueled by a fire that refused to be extinguished. "I've come too far to let it slip away now." She sank into the chair, her body sagging as the adrenaline that had propelled her through the night began to ebb. Exhaustion settled over her like a heavy blanket, her muscles aching with every breath. She pressed her hands to the desk, the cool wood grounding her as she inhaled deeply, steadying herself against the tide of emotions threatening to pull her under. The room was silent except for the distant hum of activity beyond the door officers, moving through the halls, oblivious to the seismic shift unfolding in this forgotten corner. Daniels lingered near the doorway, his silhouette framed by the faint light spilling in from the corridor. His eyes studied her with a quiet intensity, as if weighing her strength, her resolve. Cole hovered near the back, his fingers twitching nervously as he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "What now?" Anna asked, her voice cutting through the stillness, sharp with the need for direction. They couldn't afford to wait, to let the momentum slip through their fingers. Daniel's expression grew somber, his brow furrowing as he crossed his arms. "We need to act quickly," he said, his tone grave. "Gather every shred of evidence before Harris or anyone else in his circle can bury it. This isn't just one man, it's a system, and we've got to expose it all." He paused, his gaze flickering to Cole, who shrank slightly under the scrutiny. "There are still a few officers we can trust, but it's a gamble. Fear's got everyone on edge. We'll need paperwork, surveillance, anything that ties Harris and his allies to this." Anna pushed herself to her feet, her resolve hardening like steel. "I'll start with the files," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor of fatigue in her limbs. "If we can find one solid ledge, just one, it'll unravel the whole damn thing. We have to move now." Daniels gave a brisk nod, his faith in her unspoken but clear. "I'll pull the records," he replied. "We'll regroup here in an hour. Keep your head down and trust anyone until we're sure." The next hour stretched into an eternity, each second ticking by with agonizing slowness. Anna hunched over the desk, surrounded by towering stacks of files, their yellowed pages spilling secrets she'd overlooked in her earlier searches. The air grew stale, thick with the scent of dust and ink as she pored over the documents, her fingers tracing names and dates that now carried new meaning. Every detail felt vital, every scribbled note a potential key to dismantling Harris' empire. Her eyes burned from the strain, but she pressed on, driven by the weight of what was at stake. Then she saw a name that stopped her cold, Officer Mark Jackson. It appeared again and again, woven into case after case linked to Harris. Her breath caught as she flipped through the pages, her mind racing back to the hesitant young officer who'd lingered at the edge of the chaos. Earlier that night, she'd seen something in his ice guilt, perhaps, or a flicker of doubt. If Jackson was this deeply entangled, the corruption ran far deeper than she'd imagined. A sprawling network that stretched beyond the precinct's walls. She pulled a thick folder from the pile, its edges worn from years of handling, and spread its contents across the desk. Names, dates, payments all pointing to a conspiracy she could barely comprehend. When Daniels returned, his shadow falling over the cluttered desk, he leaned in close, his breath warm against her ear. "Found something?" he asked, his voice low and serious. Anna didn't hesitate. "Jackson's Humiliates everywhere, tied to Harris in ways we didn't see before. We need to dig into this, get the footage, build the case." Daniels raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable, but he didn't question her. "If Jackson's in this deep, we're looking at a hell of a fight," he said. "Let's move." The hours that followed were a blur of quiet intensity. the tension in the precinct thickening with every passing minute. Officers drifted through the halls, their footsteps a dull rhythm against the linoleum. But none seemed to notice the storm brewing in the back office. Anna and Daniels worked in tandem, gathering footage, cross-referencing files, piecing together a web of deceit that threatened to collapse under its own weight. Cole lingered nearby, his nervous energy a constant hum, but he stayed, his loyalty solidifying with every step. As midnight came and went, the clock's hands creeping past the hour, Daniels turned to Anna, his face etched with determination. "We've got it all," he said, his voice a quiet thunder. "It's time to face them." Anna rose, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and triumph. This was her momentous culmination of every risk, every sacrifice. She had the evidence to expose Harris, to bring him crashing down, and with it, a lesson carved in stone. Justice, when wielded with courage, could topple even the mightiest abuse of power. The consequences of Harris' arrogance would ripple outward, a warning to those who dared to follow in his footsteps, and Anna would see it through to the end. Anna's resolve burned like a steady flame as she steeled herself for the battle ahead. She knew Harris wouldn't go down without clawing and scrabbling for every inch of ground he could hold on to. Was a man who thrived on power, who wielded it like a weapon. But Anna wasn't the type to shrink back anymore. Fear had once been a shadow trailing her every step, whispering doubts into her ears. But now she silenced it with a single, unwavering thought. "This ends today. Let's do it," she declared, her voice cutting through the tense air with a clarity that surprised even her. It wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of someone who'd made up her mind, someone who'd drawn a line in the sand and dared the world to cross it. Beside her, Daniel matched her stride as they moved down the narrow hallway of the precinct, their footsteps soft but deliberate against the cold, unyielding concrete. The walls seemed to close in around them, the dim fluorescent lights flickering overhead, casting jagged shadows that danced across the chipped paint. Anna's pulse thrummed in her chest, a relentless drumbeat growing louder with every step toward the interrogation room. This was the momentous tipping point where everything could either unravel in their favor or spiral into chaos. She could feel the stakes pressing down on her shoulders, a heavy mantle she'd chosen to bear. Harris wasn't just a man, he was a symbol of everything rotten in the system, a festering wound that had been left to spread for far too long. The door to the interrogation room hung slightly ajar, a sliver of light spilling out into the hallway. Anna's sharp eyes darted inside, catching sight of Harris seated at the table. His back was to them, his broad shoulders squared against the blank wall as if he could will the world to bend to his command. At first glance, he looked calm to calm, almost performative in his stillness. But Anna knew better. She could see the subtle tension coiled in his frame, the way his fingers rested too tightly on the edge of the table, knuckles faintly pale. He was a predator poised to strike, waiting for the first sign of weakness. Daniel didn't hesitate. With a swift, decisive motion, he shoved the door open fully, the hinges creaking in protest. "It's over, Harris," he said, his voice a low, icy blade that sliced through the room's stagnant air. Harris turned slowly in his chair, his movements deliberate, almost theatrical. His eyes narrowed into slits as they locked onto Daniel, then flicked to Anna, sizing them up like a cornered animal assessing its odds. "You think you can take me down?" he sneered, his tone dripping with disdain. "You've got nothing." Anna stepped forward, her hands steady as she raised the thick stack of files she'd painstakingly gathered months of. Sleepless nights, covert meetings, and whispered tips distilled into this damning collection of evidence. "We have everything we need to end this, Harris," she said, her voice ringing with a quiet, unshakable finality. For just a fleeting moment, his mask slipped, his confident smirk faltered, his eyes widening ever so slightly as the realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He'd known they were watching. Of course he was too cunning not to suspect, but he hadn't expected them to piece it all together so thoroughly. The walls he'd built around himself were crumbling, and there was no dark corner left to slink into. "You're done," Anna pressed, stepping closer, her gaze boring into him. "We'll make sure the truth comes out. You can't bury it anymore." Harris's expression shifted, defiance giving way to a flicker of unease. For the first time, The man who'd ruled through intimidation and manipulation looked rattled. The air in the room grew thick with tension, the silence punctuated only by the faint hum of the overhead lights. He darted his eyes between Anna and Daniel, searching for a crack in their united front, a lifeline to pull himself out of the abyss. But there was none. "You think you can just waltz in here and erase everything I've built?" Harris growled, his voice dropping to a guttural snarl that betrayed the desperation clawing at his insides. He leaned forward, his chair scraping against the floor, his presence still imposing despite the tremor in his stance. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Anna didn't flinch. She'd faced too much threats, sleepless nights. The gnawing fear of betrayal let his bluster shake her now. "I don't need to know everything about you, Harris," she shot back, her tone steady as steel. "I just need the truth, and it's time you faced it." Daniel moved in beside her, his broad frame a silent wall of support. "You're finished," he said, his voice hard and unyielding. "The people you've been leaning on, they won't protect you anymore. You're alone." Harris's fists clenched, the veins in his hands bulging as his knuckles whitened. He shoved himself up from the chair, rising to his full height in a last-ditch effort to assert dominance. But the gesture was hollow. His legs trembled faintly, and the once impenetrable aura of invincibility he'd worn like armor was peeling away, revealing the fragile, frantic man beneath. "You're not getting away with this," he spat, taking a step closer, his eyes wild with a mix of rage and panic. Anna held her ground, unflinching, her heart pounding but her resolve unshaken. "You've been getting away with it for too long, Harris," she countered, her words sharp and deliberate. "It ends now." For a moment, the room fell silent, the weight of her declaration hanging heavy in the air. Harris's chest heaved with ragged breaths, his mind racing for a way out. But the noose was tightening, and he could feel it. Just as he opened his mouth to retort, a sudden sound shattered the standoff, distant thud of the precinct's front door swinging open, followed by the rapid clatter of footsteps echoing down the hall. Anna's hand instinctively dropped to her sidearm, her fingers brushing the cool metal as adrenaline surged through her veins. Daniel tensed beside her, his body shifting into a defensive stance, his eyes narrowing as he tracked the approaching noise. They both knew how volatile this moment Harris's allies could be storming in. To pull him out of the fire, or worse, the interrogation room door burst open, and a group of officers spilled inside, their boots scuffing the worn linoleum. At the forefront stood Sergeant Miller, a grizzled veteran with a stern, weathered face that gave little away. Anna had been wary of him from the start. His reputation as a straight shooter was overshadowed by whispers of loyalty to the old guard. "What's going on here?" Miller barked, his deep voice rumbling through the room as his sharp gaze swept from Harris to Anna and Daniel. Harris seized the moment, straightening up with a desperate gleam in his eyes. "Miller, thank God you're here," he said, his tone shifting to one of calculated relief. "They're trying to frame pinning lies on me to cover their own tracks." But Miller didn't bite. Instead, he strode forward with purpose, his heavy steps echoing with authority, and slapped a thick folder onto the table in front of Harris. "We've got your file, Harris," he said, his voice grim and resolute. "All of it. Every dirty secret you've been hiding is right here." He nodded toward Anna, a rare flicker of respect in his eyes. "She told me to stay out of it, but this is too big to ignore." Harris's face drained of color, his bravado evaporating as he stared at the folder like it was a loaded gun. He started, but Miller cut him off with a voice like a gavel striking wood. "You've been playing us all, Harris, using your badge to shield your crimes. It's over." There was no waver in Miller's tone, no hint of the camaraderie Harris might have once counted on. The sergeant's decision was final, and in that moment, Harris realized the ally he'd banked on had turned against him. Anna watched Miller closely, her mind racing. She'd hoped for the spray that someone in the chain of command would see the light, but trust didn't come easily after months of navigating a web of deceit. Could she rely on him, or was this another layer of the game? Harris opened his mouth again, but the words died on his tongue. The fight was draining out of him, replaced by a hollow, sinking dread. The game was up, and he was out of moves. "We have everything, Harris," Anna said, her voice calm but piercing. "Your connections, your manipulations, it's all here." And we're going to make sure the world knows what you've done." Miller stepped closer to Harris, his presence looming as he added, "This is bigger than you. You thought you could control it all, but no one's untouchable, not even you." The lesson was clear: power, when abused, inevitably crumbles under the weight of its own corruption. Harris's reign had been built on sand, and the tide of justice was finally washing it away. What followed was a whirlwind of motion and noise. Officers swarmed the room, collecting the last scraps of evidence, documents, recordings, names scribbled on crumpled notes that would unravel Harris's sprawling criminal network. Anna stepped back, her chest tight with a mix of triumph and exhaustion, and made the calls she'd been waiting to make. Her superiors at the FBI answered with cautious optimism, while others who'd lingered on the edges of the investigation finally stepped into the light. But as she retreated to a cluttered back office, the victory felt bittersweet. Harris was just the beginning, a single thread in a tapestry of corruption that stretched far deeper than she'd imagined. There were more names, more faces who'd looked the other way for profit or fear, and the system itself was rotten at its core. Daniel joined her, his face etched with fatigue as he slumped against the doorframe. "It's done," he said quietly, his voice rough from hours of tension. "The arrest went through. We've got him in custody." Anna nodded, but the relief she'd expected didn't come. She'd toppled Harris, yes, but the cost had been high, and the road ahead stretched long and treacherous. "It's not over, Daniel," she said, her tone firm with resolve. "There's still so much buried under this. Harris was just the start. We have to keep going, or all of this, it's for nothing." He met her gaze, his tired eyes reflecting the same stubborn determination that fueled her. After a beat, he gave a small, weary nod. "You're right," he admitted, the weight of their shared mission settling between them. The days that followed blurred into a haze of paperwork, tense meetings, and endless phone calls. Anna threw herself into the work, rallying her team to cut through bureaucratic tangles and unearth the final pieces of evidence that would hold the guilty accountable. She knew resistance would come. Those who thrived in the shadows wouldn't surrender easily. But she was ready. The fallout hit Dallas like a thunderclap, the revelation sparking public outrage as Harris's arrest made headlines. The city reeled, and Anna stood at the center of it all, a quiet force driven not by glory, but by the unshakable belief that justice, however delayed, would prevail, and that those who abused their power would face the consequences they'd long evaded. Anna Lawson stood motionless at the edge of the city, her dark eyes tracing the jagged skyline as the first hints of dawn bled into the horizon. The air was crisp, carrying the faint hum of a metropolis stirring awake, a city she'd fought so hard to protect, and one that was only now beginning to mend its wounds. She'd done it. After months of relentless pursuit, Officer Harris, the man who'd once loomed over her like a storm cloud, was gone, his corrupt empire crumbling under the weight of evidence she'd painstakingly unearthed. Other officers, too, had been swept up in the fallout, their badges tarnished by the same greed and cruelty that had fueled Harris's reign. But as the wind tugged at her coat, Anna's chest tightened with a bittersweet ache. This wasn't the end, far from it. The road ahead stretched long and treacherous, paved with more investigations, more sleepless nights, and battles she couldn't yet foresee. Yet, standing there, her resolve burned brighter than ever. Harris might have fallen, but others would claw their way up to fill the void he left behind. And when they did, Anna would be waiting, her spirit forged anew in the fires of this ordeal, ready to wage war for what was right. Her journey had begun on an ordinary afternoon, the kind where the sun hangs low and golden, casting long shadows over the cracked asphalt of a rural highway. Anna, an FBI agent with a sharp mind and an unyielding sense of duty, was driving back from a grueling investigation, her thoughts drifting between case files and the promise of a quiet evening at home. The hum of her engine was her only companion until flashing lights pierced the rearview mirror, jolting her from her reverie. A routine traffic stop she'd assumed nothing more than a minor inconvenience. She reached for her badge, its weight of familiar comfort in her hand, and rolled down the window with the calm authority of someone who'd faced far worse than a speeding ticket. But the moment Officer Harris stepped into view, his broad frame blocking the sunlight, something shifted. His eyes, cold and unyielding, raked over her, lingering on her dark skin with a disdain that made her stomach twist. When she presented her FBI credentials, his lips curled into a sneer, and he swatted the badge aside as if it were a child's toy. "That don't mean nothing to me," he spat, his voice dripping with venom, before she could protest. His hands were on her, yanking her from the car with a force that sent her sprawling onto the gravel. The world spun as Anna hit the ground, her palms stinging against the rough earth, her badge skittering across the pavement. She could feel the weight of history crashing down on her not just this moment, but centuries of it. A legacy of pain and prejudice that pulsed through her veins. This wasn't just about her. It was every indignity her ancestors had endured, every black woman who'd been dismissed, silenced, or beaten down by systems meant to shield them. As Harris loomed over her, barking orders she barely heard through the ringing in her ears, she was dragged to his patrol car and shoved into the back seat. The door slammed shut with a finality that echoed in her bones, trapping her in a cage of steel and glass. Her breath came in shallow bursts, but beneath the fear and humiliation, a fire kindled. She wasn't just an agent anymore. Ash was a symbol, a living testament to resilience in the face of a world that too often refused to see her worth. The ride to the police station was a blur of flickering streetlights, and Harris's smug taunts filtering through the partition. Anna's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of this nightmare. She knew her rights, knew the law backward and forward, but knowledge felt like a flimsy shield against the raw power Harris wielded. When they arrived at a squat, isolated precinct's peeling paint and flickering neon sign a stark contrast to the bustling city stations, she knew her heart sank. This was deliberate, a calculated move to bury her where no one would hear her cries for help. Inside, the air was thick with mildew and the sour tang of neglect. Officers milled about, their eyes sliding over her with indifference or outright hostility as Harris paraded her through the dim corridors. Her attempts to explain herself, her badge, her title, her purpose were met with mocking laughter or stony silence. Harris's cruelty was a living thing, palpable in the way he shoved her into a holding cell, his meaty hands lingering too long on her arms, his words laced with a hatred so deep it seemed to stain the air. But Anna didn't break. She couldn't. Sitting on the cold metal bench, her wrists aching from the cuffs that bit into her skin, she forced herself to breathe, to think. Her training kicked in, a lifeline in the chaos. She studied the room with chipped paint, the flickering bulb overhead, the faint scratches on the wall that hinted at others who'd been trapped here before her. This wasn't just about her pride or her freedom. It was a microcosm of something far uglier, a systemic rot that had festered unchecked for too long. Harris wasn't an anomaly, was a symptom, a product of a machine that thrived on power and impunity. As the hours crawled by, her resolve hardened. She wouldn't just survive this, dismantle it, brick by brick, until the truth lay bare for all to see. Hope flickered in the form of Officer Cole Younger, a weary man with nervous hands and a face etched with quiet conflict. He'd been there when Harris dragged her in, hovering at the edges of the scene like a shadow unsure of its place. Anna caught the way his jaw tightened when Harris barked another insult, the way his fingers twitched toward his belt as if wrestling with an impulse to intervene. At first, he said nothing, his silence a heavy thing that hung between them. But later, when the station grew quiet and Harris stepped away, Cole lingered by her cell. "This ain't right," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper, as if the words might summon trouble. Anna met his gaze, steady and unyielding, and saw something shift in him, a crack in the armor of complicity. He wasn't a hero, not yet, but he was a start. Then there was Lieutenant Daniels, a grizzled veteran with a voice like gravel and eyes that had seen too much. He stormed into the precinct like a force of nature, his presence cutting through the haze of corruption like a blade. Daniels had heard whispers of Harris's antics before, but seeing Anna cuffed, bruised, yet unbroken, lit a spark of outrage in him. "What the hell is this?" he roared, his bellow echoing off the walls as he faced down Harris. The younger officer shrank under the weight of Daniels's glare, his bravado crumbling like dry clay. Daniels didn't just demand answers, demanded action, pulling Anna from the cell and vowing to get to the bottom of this mess. In him, she found not just an ally, but a reminder that the system wasn't wholly lost. there were still those who'd fight for its soul. What unfolded next was a descent into a labyrinth of corruption, far deeper than Anna could have imagined. With Cole and Daniels at her side, she began to peel back the layers of Harris's world. Every file she unearthed, every whispered confession she coaxed from reluctant witnesses, revealed a network of officers who'd turned their badges into weapons. They protected each other, shielded by a code of silence that had choked the precinct for years. The evidence was damning payoffs, falsified reports. Brutality swept under the Rugend. It painted a picture of a system so warped it barely resembled justice. Anna felt the weight of it all pressing against her ribs, a crushing realization that the institution she'd sworn to uphold had betrayed her, and countless others. The late nights blurred together, her apartment becoming a war room of scattered papers and cold coffee, her reflection in the mirror growing gaunt with exhaustion. Yet she pressed on, driven by a truth that burned too fiercely to ignore. Justice wasn't a gift bestowed from above. It was a demand, a reckoning forged by those brave enough to face the storm. The emotional toll was relentless. There were moments when Anna faltered, when the enormity of her task threatened to swallow her whole. She'd sit alone in the dark, the silence amplifying the echoes of Harris's taunts, the bruises on her arms a cruel reminder of her vulnerability. But each time she teetered on the edge, she clawed her way back, fueled by the faces of those who'd suffered before her, nameless, faceless victims of the same machine. She thought of her grandmother, whose stories of resilience had been her bedtime tales, and of every colleague who'd ever doubted her because of her skin. This fight was bigger than her pain, bigger than her fear. It was about dismantling a legacy of abuse so no one else would have to bear its scars. When the evidence finally broke the case wide open, the fallout was seismic. Harris and his cronies were hauled before a court that couldn't ignore the mountain of proof Anna had built. The precinct trembled as the rot was excised, officer by officer, a purge that left the city reeling. But for Anna, the victory was bittersweet. She stood on that rooftop at dawn, watching the city heal, knowing the scars ran deep. Justice, she'd learned, wasn't a clean win. It was a messy, brutal struggle, a testament to the human cost of power unchecked. Harris's fall was a lesson etched in blood and sweat. Those who wield authority must answer for it, or the system they serve becomes a tyrant of its own making. Cole and Daniels, too, emerged changed. Cole, once timid, found a quiet strength in his choice to stand with her, his nervous hands steadying as he testified against his peers. Daniels, the old warhorse, carried a renewed fire, vowing to root out corruption wherever it festered. Together, they'd shown Anna that a leadership wasn't a passive thing. It was a risk, a sacrifice, a deliberate act of defiance against the tide. Their support had been her lifeline, proof that even in the darkest corners, light could still break through. As the city stirred below her, Anna's thoughts turned to the future. The fight wasn't over, perhaps it never would be, but she'd face the abyss and come out stronger, armed with a truth that could move mountains. Change begins with the unwilling, the unrelenting, the ones who refuse to bow. The lesson of her ordeal rippled far beyond the precinct walls, a clarion call against the abuse of power in all its forms. Justice demanded courage, not just from her, but from everyone, a collective roar against inequality, racism, and the systems that propped them up. Harris's downfall was a crack in the foundation, a promise that even the mightiest towers could fall when enough voices rose together. Anna Lawson, battered but unbroken, had lit a spark, and as the sun climbed higher, she knew she'd carry it forward, a beacon for a world still yearning to be just,